Okay, so our talk comes from a study which we carried out a few years ago, and it's in a paper which is in the Journal of Multilingual and Multicultural Development. It's got a long title, Reimagining Synchronous Public and School Uses of Runyoro-Rutooro and Runyankore-Rukiga in Early Childhood Education in Western Uganda. There are a lot of people involved, ourselves, Caroline Dyer from Leeds, Annette Islay from the CARD Research Centre in Western Uganda near Fort Portal. And we had two research assistants from the Mountains of the Moon who were doing their MA, Gonzaga Kazwara and Safina Tuhezi. And it's funded by the British Academy. Okay, so Uganda is, like most sub-Saharan African countries, highly multilingual, with a shifting multilingual reality. There are well over 40 indigenous languages spoken and many more because Uganda has taken in many, many refugees from the north, and they're in Kampala, from Eritrea, Ethiopia, South Sudan. And generally, we were looking at a group of languages, Bantu languages in the West here. So, I'm not succeeding here.
If you just, when mouse is just like yeah, if you go to the furthest left one, it should minimize it.
Well, I want to be able to see Margaret.
Okay, if you go to the one next to it, it should be.
Thank you. We're going to be talking about technology. So I've got some great questions for Margaret at the end. All right. So there are four languages in Western Uganda, Runyankore-Rukiga and Runyoro-Rutooro, that are closely related and mutually intelligible. Rutooro was the dominant language spoken in the schools. Uganda has an early exit local language policy. So ostensibly, local languages are encouraged in the pre-primary and nursery, and primary 1, primary 2, primary 3. So theoretically 4 years of school. So there's a lot of encouragement for local languages. But then at primary 4, so children have been in school for 3 years, there's this shift to English as the ex-colonial language, as a language of instruction. So all lessons are to be taught in English. But during that year, the transition year, to a much more subject-based, strongly classified curriculum, which has got many more demands on the students, in the actual policy, code switching translation is discouraged. And there is ambiguity about quite what it is that teachers are supposed to do. But Ugandan scholars say that this language policy is a de facto either-or monolingual policy, either local language or English. And again, we're talking about very young children. In terms of the two very key policy frameworks, there's the Early Learning Framework from 2005 and the thematic curriculum, which is a thematic curriculum local language, which came in place in 2007, actually very early amongst countries in the region, and which is printed in 11 different languages, but then there are 40 different languages, but so who selects which language? But both of those reflect this idea of the encouragement of local language and literature. So the framework is to reflect local languages, customs and situations through a stimulating and language-rich environment where we hear many short stories, songs, poems, rhymes, folk songs, riddles and puzzles. So it sounds very good. But as part of this, The idea, it's very clear in both documents that learning L1, the first language, is seen to facilitate the transfer to English, yeah, not of itself. And parents are very often tasked, or there's a construction, an idea that parents, the community, will do a lot of this work of telling stories, kind of romanticised traditional oral past. Remember, these are homes that have computers and mobile phones and books in, not a huge amount, but they're there. So there is this dichotomy already. As Margaret put it, the official expectations, since we're looking at officialdom here, are that by the end of primary 3, children should be able to do the same in both local language and English. They should read, understand, and write short stories and paragraphs, which is fine and achievable, but it's not a full proficiency, is it? It's not, you know, write short stories, 3-4 lines. That isn't full proficiency in a local language or English. The national exam shows that around 50% of students, when they're tested for English, meet the expected benchmarks. So that about half don't meet them. But, and again, Margaret, I'm always quoting you. You think that the reality is actually from UWESA, which is a citizen-led assessment, where 54.2% of learners nationally are competent at the primary 2 level in local language, but only by primary 6. So that is very slow progress. Local language is not tested nationally by the national exams. So do you see that this ambiguous positioning of local languages? So classrooms are, as ever, very much a site of struggle. And there is a reproduction of linguistic inequalities that impact on disadvantaged groups. And we're not saying here that language is the only factor, but it is one that we are looking at. And because we looked at an urban and a rural site, we could look at how some of those inequalities are reproduced. But now that, because of the SDGs, there has to be 1 year of pre-primary that is free, early childhood centres are now part of that struggle. The P4 transition year is, so is a P7 year when students transition to secondary if they're still in school. And what the study is looking at is how teachers negotiate between this language and the language policy, and the synergies where things work really well, and the disjunctures where they don't. And we're seeing that having to negotiate exerts quite a toll, both on the teachers and on the students. Just a little bit about the literature. We looked at Adejumobi's idea of the vernacular palaver, and although she's writing about West Africa, it's very pertinent to the policy here. She was saying that vernaculars, times of the missionaries and colonisation, were infantilized by the colonisers, who became scholars of African literature, rhymes, riddles, but only then Africans did not look at their own or have a chance to look academically at their own literature, but they were supposed to furnish the scholars with that literature. So she maintains that African languages were bracketed off within the imaginary of traditional past. So languages in the past, an imaginary past, and also perhaps kept in the home, a geographically bounded space. But she also says, as many scholars do, that therefore mastering English becomes a way of speaking back, which makes sense for Africans. Cummins talks about the interdependence of languages, that there is one common linguistic system, and that everybody is capable of speaking more than one language. He also maintains that you need to have a very good grasp of your first language in order to make that transition to L2, and that the initial learning, you need to have at least 6 to 8 or even 12 years of learning to read, learning to speak, learning to write in your own language. And as part of that, translanguaging is now becoming almost commonplace, certainly very much used in America between bilingual classes, English and Spanish, that sense of a fluid use of language, that you can weave in and out of language and prioritize meaning. But there's also that sense that literacy is socially situated, which is Brian Street, and contextualized and shaped by the wider socio-economic circumstances in multilingual contexts. So our study, it was very small scale. What we looked at, what we were interested in, is moving from the home, talking to parents and the community, then looking at one nursery, a pre-primary, and then looking at primary 1, 3 and 4 in the government primary school that children from the nursery school went to. So there were 5 sites. One was in a peri-urban site in Western Uganda. One was in a much more rural area where there were more Rukiga speakers. And we carried out interviews with parents and teachers and their choice of language. The nurseries were private, the 2 schools were government, and the idea is cross-sectional meant that we could do this very minute looking at the accumulation over time, although we looked at it in 2-3 weeks. It's looking to see what happens across that time as children are beginning to learn 2 languages and up to that P4. So what synergies were proffered and what disjunctures took place. Welcome. So this is the data. You can see that classrooms in the rural site were much larger than the urban until P4, and Margaret and I have discussed this, when there was already much more absenteeism in the rural site, and there was greater dropout. Margaret, I think you said the other day that many children then, as it came to P4, went to private schools, went to English medium schools. The parents in the urban site were marginally better off, and they were slightly more exposure to English because they were near a large town. In terms of data collection, it was very iterative. The instruments themselves were actually put together by a cross-national team, because this was comparative. What I forgot to say is that this study was replicated in Ethiopia, Namibia and South Africa. We communicated by email. This was pre-COVID and mobile phone. We had this in-country team workshop with Safina and Goswara and of course Margaret and me in the background. And then there was coding, and we had a second in-country workshop. So it takes time. Margaret, over to you.
All right, all right. And our findings, we found quite a number of synergies. In the home and public spaces, languages were in flux. There are a lot of translanguaging in the public and private spaces where, for example, in the home, children communicate in the language that they are used to, which they have picked from school, but their parents use a different language. For example, we have here one rural grandfather said, we support them to speak local languages. For example, we are, something is closed there, but I think it is, we are Rukiga, but the children speak Runyoro because they stay mostly with Batoro, and we don't disturb them for speaking Runyoro. When doing their home chores, they talk to us in Runyoro and we talk to them in Rukiga, mixing English only sometimes. So we have this fluidity of languages in the market. a client may not know Rutooro and someone tries to communicate in English at the workplace, places of worship, they may use English, but then they will need a translator, or they may use Rutooro, but not both at the same time. So these mixtures and translanguaging back and forth is very common. Children themselves do their schoolwork when they're at home with the help of their friends and older siblings in English, because their assignments are usually in English. Next, Joe. Next.
I've done it.
We also found second sets of literacy acquisition outside of school, where children would be writing on any surface available, on the walls, on the doors, and then older siblings, visitors, and neighborhood children helping their friends to read and understand the schoolwork, which they would be doing in English. As far as parents' expectations are concerned, the parents support the use of the local language because they have come to realize that children are now able to read when they learn in the local language. They also expect that the school will help the children to learn the culture through oral literature. And of course, this is contrary to what the curriculum takes, the early learning framework for ECD and the thematic curriculum presumes, because they assume that it is parents back home who will be helping children. The parents admit that they don't tell stories anymore because they don't have time. Most parents agree that any language would be acceptable, especially at the primary, at the ECD level. One rural grandfather said, "Harulengo rwa nursery orulimi rwona." In other words, at the nursery level, any language can do. And when it comes to primary, they want both Rutooro and English, mainly for the cultural reasons that we have just talked about, and they are acquiring literacy skills, but they also want English to be used because it is a high-class language, and the exams, national exams, are in English. As one rural mother said, by top nursery class, they expect the children will be able to speak basic English. And the urban mother said they should be able to have mastered the language, meaning English language. And that is by the top nursery class. Next. Next.
Yeah, I'm there.
Okay, at the ECD, in the rural area, the language of instruction used is English. This is contrary to what the early learning framework for ECD that gives guidelines for ECD states, because it clearly says that the language of instruction should be the local language. The children in our area of study were Bachiga, Runyankore, and Batoro. The teacher was a Rukiga speaker, and when going through the lessons, she would code switch or translate from English to Rutooro. The teacher admitted that they told stories to children rarely and not every day. When it came to the period right before going home, which they call home time, the children go through a lot of songs, a lot of rhymes, both in Rutooro and English. At the urban ECD, they follow the guidelines of the early learning framework. They use Rutooro, and there is a lot of multilingual, multimodal approaches. For example, for 2 lessons, they went through 11 songs, both in English and Rutooro. The teacher told us that they have a story told to the children in Rutooro on a daily basis, and they encourage learners to provide extended oral responses to questions. For example, no hamanyire njangu. Who knows a cat? They don't expect just maybe a yes or no. They expect children to answer and respond. When it comes to the teaching of the English lesson, there is a lot of repetition. For example, this is an apple class. What is this? Then the class repeats. But the teacher would also sometimes translate some words so that what she is talking about is clear to the learners. Next. Next.
Yep, it's a delay.
All right. At the rural primary school, they are following the thematic guidelines of teaching in Runyoro-Rutooro or Runyoro-Rutooro, which is the local language. And the teaching is very productive. It's very lively. The children have pair talk, group talk. They make predictions from pictures. They listen. They answer comprehension questions. They get involved in collaborative writing. But the teacher admitted that they don't have a library and they have few storybooks. And those few they have, they don't use them often. At primary 3, the teacher was a Rutooro speaker, but it so happened that the teacher before him who handled that class was a Rukiga speaker. And when he went to the training, the sharp training, he asked for textbooks that were in Rukiga. And so the P3 teacher who inherited the class found himself in a situation where he has texts that are for Rukiga, but he must teach in Rutooro. And as he told us jokingly that he's acquiring Rukiga as his second language. The oral stories, he told us, are told from one child to another. And he says this makes them fluent. But remember, the thematic curriculum expected that it is the parents that were to pass on these stories. Now it is children telling other children's stories. When it came to P4, because it is supposed to be a transitional class, and they are supposed to be teaching Rutooro as a subject, but to shift to English as a language of instruction, they stopped teaching Rutooro altogether. And in the English class, what was happening is that there was a lot of repetition, and the structures were being repeated over and over to help the learners get them. So you here in P1, yes, I am, no, I am not, back and forth to help the learners get the structure. And the teacher said that when they fail to understand what I'm talking about, then I help them in English so that they may understand better. When it came to P3, they had a non-fictional text, which they were reading out, but the text was not so easy for the learners, and the teachers had asked them to read it in a choral manner, and the teacher had to do some code switching to explain some parts. In P4, the teacher said, I know it's not allowed to use the local language when you are teaching English, and so he stuck to English even when the learners did not seem even to understand what was going on. They had very few texts. For a class of over 40, they had close to maybe 6 or 7 texts. So the majority of the learners were not even seeing what they are reading chorally. And so what was going on was a lot of very few children involved, and the rest just remaining in the background. Next.
That's just some materials from the rural primary school.
All right, here we have what we saw, what we found as print material in the rural primary school.
Okay. The urban primary school, Margaret.
Next.
Yeah, I'm there.
Okay, in the urban primary school, they too followed the thematic curriculum guidelines, and they also strictly followed the sharp guidelines and textbooks. Teaching Rutooro in literacy in Rutooro, and as a language of instruction, the language was productive, meaning making, a lot of incidental reading practice, and children were very lively, and they both for comprehension as well as for writing collaboratively. At P3, still it was very energetic pair and group discussion, and the lesson always tried to use children's home knowledge or knowledge and connecting it to their home life. For example, the teacher said, if you were given chickens to look after, what would you have done? And of course, that generates a lot of discussion, and children are confident and they answer. P4, formal teaching of Rutooro was not there, just like in the rural area. In fact, the urban primary 4 teacher admitted that the children had begun to decline as far as reading of the local language was concerned. And then teaching English, it was also taught using the sharp program and books, and it was quite productive. In P1, there were lots of songs, rhymes, actions, group work, pair work, syllabic beating of words, and all that. When it came to P4, they had also poems, songs, open questions, and they had a non-fiction text on beekeeping, and it was also quite lively. In P4, in the urban school, the text was quite hard for the learners, and the teacher took liberty to code switch and translate to facilitate understanding. And for example, he would ask a question like, what does excitement mean? And the children would, or one of the children would answer, which means excessive happiness. Over to you, John.
Thank you. Right, so you can see the accumulation and the detail, and this is what qualitative research can do, to give you that really granular understanding of, but you can see already how the teachers are negotiating and having to move in and out. What we also did was to ask the teachers what their expectations were. Remember the benchmarks, the literacy. We asked them, what do you think your class can do? And in P1, both teachers had really high expectations because the kids could read. Half of them were able to read a story, others can read sentences, and many others. So that's pretty good if you think, they're supposed to read whole stories and paragraphs by primary 3. But then by primary 3, there was a decline. So that although in the urban site, and you can see that there was the teachers in the urban site were that much more experienced and better able to negotiate. They said, yeah, 80% of learners can read in Runyoro. In primary 3, 25% could meet the benchmarks, those who had well-to-do parents. Yeah? So can you see it's beginning to drop? By P4, which was only English, then they could read words. But by P4, they should be reading, going on from the primary 3 benchmarks. And in the urban school, by the 3rd term of primary 4, because this was the middle of their school year, they'll be okay. But she reckoned that only around 100 out of 170 across all the learners would actually reach the benchmarks for English. So there's this drain, this cognitive wastage. So we were looking at the synergies. Yeah, we started from the home and the community and the nursery and all that. So when you see over time, what are the synergies that really proffer advantage, that accumulate? What gives that kind of linguistic capital? They attend early nursery. I think one teacher, Margaret, she said something like, I've got about 30 out of 80 in my class, and those who went to nursery learn much faster, but of course they will. If they regularly listen to songs and stories in the local language, like we saw in the urban nursery school, if they produce as well as reproduce language, so using language, even in the urban school, they were using English almost like a vernacular, so that it's productive. If they're able to talk to others, Julia, you'll like that. And there's incidental reading. We saw that there's incidental reading and planned reading going on in the home and the community. The siblings, the older children, read with the others. In fact, when we met, Margaret and I met the team from South Africa, we all said, actually, teaching just sound to letter, that kind of basic decoding happens in the school. Learning comprehension happens at home. So that's really important. Their teachers closely monitor them, and that did go on better in the urban school because they had smaller classes and the teachers could move up and down. And the teachers were able to go from just one language to code switching, translation, and into translanguaging. And all that did, in the end, help the transfer to English, which still remains a goal. Where there are disjunctures, where English is assumed to be a familiar language, where English is used as the medium of instruction, but the teacher, her own English, is not so proficient, so that they get more code switching means you don't have so much exposure to English, so you don't learn so much, but you might understand. Do you see, it gets very complicated. Those speakers, Runyoro was the formal mother medium of instruction, but there were many, many Rukiga speakers, because it's multilingual, but they were kind of marginalised. Where there was a lot of repetition, reproduction, as Margaret said, a lot of choral work, fewer opportunities for incidental reading, monolingualism, little monitoring, and absenteeism. So what you see through that granular analysis is that, as Adam and Joby has talked about, the Runyoro language, or local language and literacy, is just bracketed off. It just stops. It's supposed to continue to be taught at P4, but in these two schools, there was silence, especially in the rural school. It's literally stopped. So that it didn't continue. English just took over. And there was this widening disjunction. You think about the very rich home community, there was this widening disjunction between home, public and school spaces. I'm aware of time. So what do we conclude? Last slide. That sense of accumulative cognitive wastage that Milligan and others have talked about, policy-driven epistemic injustice, where children learn and get to be really quite good, as they should be, as any 7, 8-year-old, and then it goes. And as Tiongo talks about, it becomes a normalisation of the absurd, and Margaret has said, so teachers are teaching English and sticking to the policy, while they know that their learners don't understand them. So hamstrung by that. And it's very difficult not to conclude, as many have, that a shift to a later exit local language, maybe primary 5, I think you're in favour of that, Margaret, primary 6, would be better. So learners get just to become more competent in their local language and have a really firm base. They can continue to learn English. It would encourage, the policy needs to encourage the social practice of translanguaging, and that would reflect the linguistic ecology children live and learn in. And those really good pedagogies that we saw in the primary, in the P1 teachers in particular, they could really be given free rein to be creative and use what they know. The pedagogies were absolutely brilliant. Remember, really large classes, and the children were learning and having a really good time. And the teachers would then be able to do the cultural work that parents are supposed to do but can't because they're very busy. It would also free the vernacular and its literature from that infantilizing bracket and extend the idea of the local. And that's where we're at. Thank you very much.